Hi guys. Before we proceed to this video, we've got something very important to share with you. Neoliberalism, Inequality and Authoritarianism by Professor John V. Kofis is available for purchase. You can order it directly from the publisher Little French eBooks or through Amazon.
How are you, sir?
I'm great, Assad. Thank you very much. It's great to see you again.
Thank you for
And hello
joining
to
me, sir.
everyone.
Yes, hello, viewers. Hello to everyone. Uh, sir, the first question that we have regarding Mr. Noam Chomsky is, what is the Cold War historical context of Mr. Chomsky's academic life?
Yes, Noam Chomsky was born in 1928 and was a very young teenager during the Great Depression, growing up in Philadelphia. That's where he was born. His parents were Eastern European Jews, and according to his own words, he experienced some anti-Semitism growing up in Philadelphia, predominantly Catholic back then. And he was profoundly influenced by the Great Depression, the turmoil of the Great Depression, and then World War II, of course. Noam Chomsky had a very harmonious relationship with his parents, both of his parents, educators, both in Hebrew school, and apparently influenced by both his mother and especially his father in pursuing linguistics. He became famous during the Cold War. By 1955, he became famous when he was associated with Harvard and then, of course, secured a position at MIT where he worked for a very long time. Interestingly enough, Professor Chomsky's scholarly endeavors and his fame started with the field of linguistics and the cognitive theory of linguistics, namely that language is innate in human beings as a species and unique to human beings as a species, as is grammar universally. So he went against the behavioral psychologists like B.F. Skinner at the time, but even someone I studied as an undergraduate philosophy major, Ludwig Wittgenstein, in studying philosophy of language, with whom, of course, Chomsky also disagreed. Chomsky became, at a very young age at MIT, not just a success within academia in the United States, but a success internationally because of the cognitive linguistics theory. Now, growing up, however, in the late 50s, being in academia, I should say, in the late 50s, as a very young academic, by the way, in the late 50s, during the Cold War, he was influenced by the combination of the Cold War, the persecution of the Cold War, namely of intellectuals, from writers to journalists to Hollywood directors, by the way, who were critics of the Cold War and pacifists. And this is one of the passions of Noam Chomsky from early on in the last 70 years, from the 1950s to the present. That is, he's a pacifist and an internationalist. He then became involved because during the Cold War in the United States, the civil rights movement emerged. And he was not just interested in writing about the civil rights movement and the racial injustice in the United States, but he was also active. He was an activist. He actually took part in marches, and there are photographs of him with others in civil rights marches. The Cold War molded him, combined with the Vietnam War and the civil rights movement. So social justice is the foundation of Noam Chomsky's thinking. Now, because he had the association and remained, of course, at MIT, one of the finest universities in the world, not just in the United States, but in the world, by the way. And he was in theoretical linguistics. He was able to use that, and to his credit, by the way, and we'll talk more about a book that he even wrote on this subject, to go off and to deal with issues of war and peace, social justice, to deal with civil rights issues, and to deal with foreign policy, especially of the United States, given that he was a young academic growing up during the Vietnam War, and he experienced the mass opposition as the Vietnam War was unfolding, from the Kennedy to the Johnson to the Nixon era until Ford, of course, when it ended. So all of that molded his mind. And he had a deep philosophical commitment and a moral commitment. This is beyond philosophical and intellectual commitment. Because Noam Chomsky, as he has pointed out, by the way, when throughout the decades, when they ask him, conservative and right-wing critics say to him, well, you and academics like you are poisoning the minds of university students because American academia is filled with leftist dissident intellectuals like you. And Chomsky's answer is, of course, based on empirical answer. And he points out, and I was in academia, I can tell you that's exactly correct, that academia historically has been the domain of those who conform, not those who are dissidents like Chomsky. Chomsky is the exception, not the mainstream. Everyone in academia knows to get ahead, you conform. Just as they know that in the corporate world, to get ahead, you conform. In journalism, to get ahead, you conform. In mass media, it stands to reason that those who conform reap the rewards of careerism, to use that term, of advancement in career and the benefits. Now, Chomsky managed to be very successful, by the way, in every respect. In every respect, and we'll talk more about his academic, his scholarly achievements, and still remain for 7 decades a dissident voice, not just within the United States, but globally. The name Noam Chomsky is known worldwide, and it starts from the Cold War era to the present. And one of the reasons is because Noam Chomsky has written so much about global affairs that they are well aware of him. However, another thing that many people may not know is this man has had contacts with academic scholars, politicians globally throughout his career. In my view, Noam Chomsky is the prototype dissident academic who is relevant, as relevant and even more so today than he was during the civil rights movement of the 1960s, when he was marching for the civil rights of African Americans. So the Cold War, from the old Cold War to the new Cold War, which Noam Chomsky criticizes and calls for what has been happening in Ukraine during the Biden presidency madness, which it is, by the way, and severely criticizing the genocide war in Gaza. This makes this man utterly realistic, extremely lucid in his thinking and rational, and pursuing social justice and peace, by the way, globally. And yet today, Professor Chomsky uh, is 96 years old. So we have here someone of such an advanced age with such a brilliant mind, still in very high demand, by the way, in a very high demand. Many people within the United States and outside the United States want an interview with Professor Chomsky because they know what he has to say, by the way, is not platitudes. He's not a populist. He doesn't try to please the audience to say what they want to hear. He explains analytically from a structural perspective, never attacking people personally, by the way, even people in highest office. I remember seeing an interview with him. Someone from Wall Street was asking him, "Well, why are you criticizing corporate CEOs and so forth?" He said, "Have you ever heard me say anything negative personally about any corporate CEO?" And he's right. He doesn't do that. He has a structural approach to issues. He doesn't attack people individually. He analyzes the structure. And the structure he criticizes is capitalism, state-supported capitalism, to be more accurate, as he puts it, militarism and imperialism. That is at the core of what he criticizes. He doesn't attack individuals. He looks at the system, so he's a structuralist. And I think the Cold War, from the old one to this one right now, the new one, shifting again with China at the far end, but Russia immediately the target. All of that has made this man relevant and he remains relevant. And there have been articles about how Chomsky is still relevant and important for young people, especially to read and to look at his videos and hear what he has to say about issues. Assad.
Sir, you just mentioned that Professor Chomsky participated in the civil rights movement for advocating the equal rights for African Americans during the 1960s. So I would like to know, uh, does he promote anarchism? If yes, what has been his role in anarchist theory?
Yes, Noam Chomsky makes no secret that, in fact, he's firmly grounded in anarchism. He was influenced by 19th century anarchists, including the French Joseph Pierre Proudhon, um, property theft. He is grounded in anarchist ideology, but he was also influenced by 19th century Marxism, obviously. He is not a Marxist, and he agrees with Mikhail Bakunin, the other major anarchist, and I should say not the other, but another major anarchist of the 19th century, that Marxism falls short as far as Chomsky is concerned, because of the dictatorship of the proletariat concept that developed. And of course, he's also a critic of Leninism. He was critic of Lenin, critic of Stalin, doesn't really differentiate between Lenin and Stalin. That's where I also have, having taught Russian history for a long time in higher education, I also disagree with him. Um, I respect Noam Chomsky tremendously. I accept his vision of a society where the working class associations, um, in accordance with anarchist ideology, not a hierarchy, a capitalist hierarchy, are in charge. Um, I understand his concern about the dictatorship of the proletariat. I understand his concern about the centralized state, the super state. Um, I understand about his concern about the hierarchy within the Soviet bureaucracy as it existed. All of that is valid. Perfectly understandable what happened in the Stalinist period. Now, I do have my disagreements when it comes to, in my view, it's a stretch, like I said, to identifying the Stalinist era with the very brief period of Lenin, who, along with Leon Trotsky, by the way, tried to do their best. The revolution took place, in the Bolshevik Revolution took place, which he doesn't see, by the way. He looks at it more as a coup. In any case, that's something else, that another long debate. I understand his concerns. A great deal happened in the molding of the Soviet Union. In the process of Lenin, there was a civil war, there were foreign invasions, there was mass starvation. Lenin had to adopt some harsh measures to enforce um, uh, communist policies, especially the end of private property, uh, the the government farms, the collectives, and so forth. Even worse with Stalin, Stalinizing Russia, using Ivan the Terrible, one of the early czars of on which the Romanov dynasty, the Russian dynasty, the Romanov dynasty rested. Um, but I think that the goals of Noam Chomsky are for a socially just society, a society that is as free of hierarchies as possible, of exploitation, as free of exploitation as possible. And that I deeply respect him for it. The nuances about, uh, you know, uh, and he recognizes, by the way, he too recognizes, let me again repeat that, he also recognizes aspects of Marxism, the class analysis part, for example, and he does use class analysis himself. He has, um, and above all, this is someone who pursues. I look at the goals, not the means to get to the goals. The goals are basically to get us to a socially just society. I also have deep respect for Noam Chomsky, by the way, for as long as I have been studying him, and we'll talk about my incidental encounters with him. Um, I know that he's a very practical. He has a very practical mind. Very, I think, pragmatic mind. Yes, there are the disagreements within the leftist community and intelligentsia, the leftist intelligentsia, and the wider leftist movement. That, well, Noam Chomsky is an anarchist. He also has criticisms of them. For example, he has argued that the new left especially in academia, okay, has used a lot of um, neo-Marxist, postmodernist theories, which he dismisses, and I, to a large degree, I agree with him, by the way, so that academics can advance their careers, and there isn't much substance there. I agree with him on that. Again, I respect his goals for a just society, socially just society. Above all, this is a person I respect because he um, is someone who is rooted in the Enlightenment era, by his own admission, by the way, in the just like in the rationalism of the Enlightenment, just like Albert Einstein, who was a socialist. He too, and accepted the Enlightenment era progressive ideals. He too is rooted in that. Again, he has said as much, he has written as much. And he is interested in a socially just society with environmental justice. One of his passions, by the way, and we can talk more about this, is environmental justice. Nuclear disarmament is another one. Okay. So this is someone who, issue by issue, is a man, in my view, who is very practical. Um, when it comes to looking at that uh, war in Ukraine, where there is no military solution, he was one of the first to come out and argue this is madness, which it is. There's a diplomatic solution here, and it isn't sought. Why not? The other madness is Israel. Noam Chomsky, by the way, who is Jewish and has accepted the collectivist aspect of Zionism, by the way, influenced by his parents, he has accepted the collectivist aspect of Zionism, categorically rejected the Lebensraum, German word which means living space, imperialism, in other words, and the militarism of Zionism. He's rejected that. Very long-term critic, consistent. This man is consistently against the Zionist state in Israel. He has a long-standing record on that. Okay, so I look at that. I look at Noam Chomsky. You know, the anarchist label, by the way, I can tell you, has been used against him by the left and the right and the center. They have all, well, he's an anarchist. Meaning what? So, okay, what does that mean? That we invalidate everything that this brilliant academic, a scholar who has made major contributions, by the way, in everything from theoretical linguistics, psychology, philosophy, to foreign affairs. We dismiss this person, we invalidate because we use the word, well, he's an anarchist. What does that mean? There are all sorts of anarchists. There have been since the 18th century, and then in the 19th century it became a movement, and it was the anarchists who were really involved, heavily involved in the trade union movement, both in Europe and in the Western Hemisphere, by the way. Anarchists were involved from Russia to Latin America to the United States in organizing workers to improve their lives. Yes, there were anarchists who wrote things that may seem out of place and out of time to people today in the era of neoliberalism. But the era of neoliberalism is tyranny. According to Chomsky, who has written on this, by the way, and I agree entirely with him, as I also have written, as you know, on this issue as well. Go ahead.
Sir, you have interviewed Professor Chomsky many times, and you have had many encounters with Professor Chomsky. Uh, how did you have those encounters with Professor Noam
It
Chomsky?
Assad it was, it was coincidental. uh, I was just beginning my academic career in 1979 when the Iranian Revolution broke out, and then the Sandinista Revolution in Nicaragua broke out. And a year later, a professor of sociology at Loyola University in Chicago, myself, and a professor of philosophy got together, and we went. Loyola University in Chicago, by the way, is a Jesuit university. We met with some of the Jesuit priests who were in the administration and said, we would like to do a huge conference on the Nicaraguan Revolution. Nicaragua, by the way, Latin America, is predominantly Catholic. Jesuits are the intellectuals of the Catholic Church. So this is Loyola University had an interest in what was happening in a Catholic country. And I recall they said, yes, we will, in fact, give you a grant and you can organize. This was to be a conference with several thousand people, at least a couple of thousand people. And the colleagues from philosophy and sociology and I said, well, who should we have as a keynote speaker? And we all agreed Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky, this is about 1980, I think it was 1980. No, this is 44 years ago. Um, Noam Chomsky had, in fact, spoken and written about this. So they said to me, go ahead, contact him. That was the first time I contacted. Now, that did not work out. We did not get Noam Chomsky. Different schedules, conflicts for support. We did get a Filipino scholar educated at Princeton and taught in California, in fact. His name, a big name in scholarship and politics in the Philippines, also in the United States. His name was Walden Bello, who actually is someone that knew Chomsky, had, in fact, throughout his career, worked with, collaborated in different aspects with Noam Chomsky. And just a few years ago, Noam Chomsky endorsed him when Walden Bello ran for political office in the Philippines. So we got someone who was along the same lines. Different approach. Walden Bello, by the way, brilliant intellectual, a Filipino intellectual, who at that time was more interested in international political economy, just like me, and looked at the World Bank and IMF and corporate manipulation in the global South, including in his own country, in the Philippines, by the way. Walden Bello was famous for that. Walden Bello did a beautiful job. Uh, Chomsky would have had a different approach. Walden Bello was more in international political economy. Chomsky would have been more in geopolitical issues. But that was the first time that I contacted. Then a few years later, in the mid 80s, I think it was 85, 86, one of my mentors, who was at Northwestern University, and he had left at the time. He was for a long time at Northwestern University, and then he went to University of California, San Diego. Wrote to me. He had written a foreword to one of my books. I had just completed a manuscript on the Cold War, the early Cold War in the Eastern Mediterranean, with Greece as the focal point, but it covered, of course, Turkey, Iran, and of course Europe. And his name is L.S. Stavrianos. He's passed away, but Stavrianos was famous in the 1980s for publishing a book called Global Rift: The Third World Comes of Age. He was he had the friendship with Noam Chomsky. He He knew Noam Chomsky. He explained to Noam Chomsky that in reading my work, he noticed a good deal of material pertaining to national security. And I had, of course, I always used archival material, and some of the documents, um, declassified, of course, State Department and CIA. Chomsky was working on a different project. He wanted some of those documents. So Stavriano said, Noam Chomsky, by the way, is interested in looking at some of that material because he's working on a parallel project. That was the second time. That was the second contact. So, and that was that. At that time, I wrote. I got the impression he was really interested in CIA operations in the Eastern Mediterranean. Fine, I sent the documents. Um, the third time was in the early 2000s. I had just finished another book, and I sent it to him and asked him if he could read it, and if you saw anything that he thought was worthy, um, that he could endorse the book, and he did that. And then finally, I had during the COVID period, a colleague from the United States contacted me and said, "How do you like to interview Noam Chomsky? We can do a couple of interviews with him. And since you're in neoliberalism and he's written on neoliberalism, and you can ask him about other issues, foreign policy and so forth." So we did a couple of interviews with Noam Chomsky on that score, and I did ask him on environmental issues. I asked him on neoliberalism, and I found him to be a very pragmatic man, very lucid in his thinking. Remember, this is not someone who is 35 years old. This is someone who is in his 90s, but his brain is very clear, very lucid, and he's very focused, by the way. And the remarkable thing about Noam Chomsky, by the way, is that his brain is like an encyclopedia. He doesn't look at notes. It's everything. He recollects everything. When he can start talking about the Indian subcontinent and U.S. foreign policy in the Indian subcontinent, it's all recollection. And then switch and talk about Brazil, and it's all recollection. So this is a brilliant man, and the analysis is based on a socially just foundation, a moral foundation. By the way, this is a very moral individual who looks not just at what happens, but what happens for whose benefit and who is harmed by what happens. That's very important, very important. Without regard to race, religion, ethnicity, gender, all of that. Okay? The true ideals of the Enlightenment. This is what this man embodies. So those were my encounters with Noam Chomsky. And I know he's in huge demand because in his website, he points that out. I remember watching a video that he did not so long ago where the interviewer, this is an interviewer who represented Wall Street, in fact, of Iranian background himself, but lives in the United States, very right wing. And he basically was confrontational with Noam Chomsky, and all along asking him if he loved America. And Noam Chomsky had a very rational answer. As he said, I love people, I can't love a country. There are aspects, he said, I like about the United States. There are other aspects like militarism and imperialism, which I don't like about the United States. So I don't like the fact that obviously these are people these are Europeans who came here, took the land from the natives. There was slavery. So those aspects, how can I like those aspects? He gave him a very rational, pragmatic answer. But yet the focus was, oh, you must not like the United States if you are a critic of U.S. foreign policy. This is the main sort of questions. And then at the very that he got, that Noam Chomsky was subjected to. And then at the very end, the individual said, I would like to bring, and he named, I forget his name, he's an economist, he's a Milton Friedman economist, an African American, far right wing and neoliberal, so that you and this man can have a debate. And Noam Chomsky said, well, I'm sorry, but I don't have the time, and I know who this person is. I don't see what interest I have in all of this. And so it was very clear that the purpose was to exploit the fame of Noam Chomsky and to have this engage in polemics. And Noam Chomsky, in spite of his age, advanced age, immediately picked up on it and brushed it off. Um, so this is not someone who, like I said, this is the only other person, by the way, that I have known in my academic career who was this lucid was not nearly as famous anywhere as famous was Ronald Hilton at Stanford University. Who was in his 90s as well, when I joined the World Association of International Scholars at Stanford University 25 years ago, I found it incredible that Ronald Hilton could be that lucid in his thinking, rational, and all the way up to the time he became ill and unfortunately he passed away. So we're talking about someone who is relevant, who knows exactly what he's saying, and who has a moral foundation for his intellectual pursuits. Not opportunistic, by the way, because opportunism is what governs people in careers, not idealism and moral fiber as it is with Noam Chomsky.
Sir, I would like to know how these encounters with Professor Chomsky influenced your career. Did these encounters have some influence in your career? How did you grow professionally? How did you learn things? Was there any influence on your career?
Well, I explained my encounters with him. They were incidental. They were spread from 1980 to the early 2020s. A couple of years ago, when I interviewed him with a colleague. Um, but I mean, let me just put this into perspective. Noam Chomsky has written more than 150 books. I have not read 150 books that Noam Chomsky has written. I have read some of his works, but certainly not all. I deeply respect, let me just mention a couple of them. I deeply respect that he wrote a work and it influenced me profoundly, entitled Manufacturing Consent, about the media. He was a co-author of that. Manufacturing Consent was a monumental work. Now, Edward Said, a Palestinian American university professor, who knew Chomsky, by the way, he's passed away, um, had written a book called Orientalism, where he argued that the Western media has a bias of Orientalism. They look at everything from a Euro-Atlantic perspective when it comes to Arabs and Muslims in the Middle East. Chomsky went beyond that, went back to a work that Walter Lippmann, I think it was 1920 when Walter Lippmann, the American political scientist and journalist, had written that consent, public opinion, is manufactured, basically. We're talking, in other words, a long time ago. This is 100 years, more than 100 years ago. And then Noam Chomsky was also influenced by, and I'm sorry, I forget, I had written this in one of my books, but I forget the name, an Australian scholar who wrote a brilliant book, how the corporate world, through its influence of this in the state, manufactures public consent. People think that they have a free will and they give their consent, but it's manufactured. And the brilliance in the elites doing this is that people believe that it's theirs when in fact they're just throwing back what has been manufactured, indoctrinated in their heads. I think that's one of his best works, but it's not the only one. The Responsibility of Intellectuals to Speak the Truth, another book, very important, by the way. That's a very important book because intellectuals from the earliest times to the present are interested, like all intellectuals are different than any other human being. They're interested in career advancement, promotion, and the goods that life provides with conformity. Chomsky comes out and said, we have a duty as intellectuals, as educators, to speak the truth. And he is a rare entity in this. Now, just briefly, I don't want to bore you with all this. Throughout history, from ancient times to the present, most intellectuals represent the status quo. Noam Chomsky is a critic, and when he was asked in one of the interviews in a television program, why are you a critic of the status quo? His answer was, because I want to improve the life of people in society. If all I do is eulogize meaning praise, if all I do is march in a parade, yes, and wave the flag, I'm not helping anybody and I'm not helping to improve society. I want to point out the shortcomings of our society. So I'm pointing out the shortcomings of our society so that we have a better society. And the lives of human beings are improved. These are the ideals of the age of the Enlightenment. So when he said that he was a product of the age of the Enlightenment, just like Albert Einstein, also a socialist, he was right. He was a product of the Enlightenment. I was influenced by Noam Chomsky. I was a young man. He was not the only one that was like, they asked Noam Chomsky, who influenced you? And he said a lot of people, and a lot of people did influence him, from anarchists to Marx to Bertrand Russell, the British philosopher, by the way. Various people influenced, even people whose work he criticized, like B.F. Skinner, the psychologist, for example, and Ludwig Wittgenstein that I mentioned. So he has many influences, and I was influenced by him. It's just that I find him incredibly pragmatic, rational, committed to social justice, and the underlying foundation of his work has a moral base. By the way, it just occurred to me, he has severely criticized, and I agree with him entirely, that moral relativism is something that can be taken seriously, because he points out, and rightly so, this is again the rationalist Chomsky, rightly so, because in our daily lives, he points out, we constantly make moral decisions. You can't be a moral relativist and function in reality. I like the realism in Noam Chomsky, That doesn't mean, by the way, I agree with everything. When I asked him, for example, I'll give you one instance. When I asked him in one of the many questions, one of the questions I asked him is, because I know how much is committed, by the way, to um, environmental justice, climate change. He's very committed to that. And he's right. This is the planet we inhabit. This is the planet we live on. We have limited time to reverse the damage caused so far by the Industrial Revolution of the last 300 years. He's absolutely correct. I asked him, I'll tell you what, and he took me to task on this. I said, well, the environmental movement has been co-opted by banks, corporations, the state, opportunistic politicians. He said, look, I don't care if a big bank has co-opted the environmental movement. If they're going to do something practical to contribute to saving the environment, that's all I care about. We don't have a long-term time horizon here. He's absolutely correct. So that kind of pragmatism. Um, I was impressed by. I'm impressed by that. He said, "Look, okay." And then he talked about, we talked about. I asked him a question on the media, and I know what he thinks historically about the New York Times and some of the mainstream press and so forth. He said, look, they have some very good reporters in science, for example. And he's right. They do have very good reporters in science. And I'll take that as a positive. So he does look to take the positive aspects and he figures, well, let's use that to build on something, at least to lessen the problems we have in the domain of the environment, for example. Okay. So, um, he doesn't get lost in theoretical nuances. He doesn't look. He's well aware, by the way. This is a man who studied philosophy, and psychology as a young man um, um, at Harvard in Pennsylvania, um, and he's written about it. He's well aware of that, all that, but he is rooted in pragmatic solutions. Okay. Um, and that's something, like I said, I respect and I recognize because we do live in the present when we do have a short-term horizon to fix problems, and we fix one at a time. you know Go ahead. Assad, are you there? Yes.
Sir, how has mainstream media received Professor Chomsky?
They have not obviously his every it's not that he hasn't been on some mainstream media. He has on occasion, including the BBC, I believe. He has, but this is not someone they bring on to analyze issues because they know what they're going to hear. They know when you bring on Noam Chomsky, you know what to expect. They bring the mainstream media historically takes people who will reinforce the corporate agenda. Noam Chomsky is a critic of the corporate agenda. They bring on people who will reinforce state supported capitalism as he is a critic of it. They're not going to bring on Noam Chomsky because they know he's going to criticize that. And they also know he's going to criticize the media itself. Okay. Because he has been a critic of it. Manufacturing consent is a critique of the media, that it's under corporate control. So they're not going to bring him on. So what is now? He has found ways. He doesn't need them really. He transcends the corporate media. He has found ways. This is what another thing I admire about Chomsky, by the way, because ever since my very first uh, contact, when I asked him to come to Loyola University in Chicago and be the main speaker, this is a man who transcends all of that. He has still managed to be worldwide famous. I forget what country in Europe I was at one point, and I said I was hesitant to mention. Well, this is I forget what an issue I was talking about foreign policy, and I said, well, Noam Chomsky has written about this, and the person I was talking to was in insurance or some field. And they go, oh yeah, I know who that is. He often, some of his work often appears in some of the independent newspapers. I was surprised that there were people that you wouldn't expect outside of academia to know who Noam, and yet they knew. He is known globally. So the fact that mainstream media has bypassed him, and why would you bring on Noam Chomsky if you're CNN? God forbid Fox News. They're not going to do that unless they want to engage in polemics to bring him on to say, you hate America, as they tell. And even some of the videos that he has done, and he has agreed to go, and he obviously has gone with some of the right wing. Do you hate America? Do you hate Israel? And you hate capitalism. You hate our way of life, and things like that. Questions of that. I mean, he knows that if he goes to those programs, that's what he can expect. He was asked. I remember there was a television program, and this is a number of years ago, a couple of decades ago. I think it's connected. It's a government. It's connected. It picks up. I forget what it's called. It picks up the news from Congress, from the Senate, from the House of Representatives, government news. But it's televised. It's a cable news channel, and he was on. And the anchor was a serious person, but mainstream media person, and said to him, Professor Chomsky, would you rather go back to linguistics? This is where you started, theoretical linguistics and philosophy and psychology. Or are you really interested in US foreign policy, environmental justice, civil rights, social justice issues, critic of the capitalist economy under neoliberalism? And he answered very truthfully that he enjoyed the intellectual stimulation of theoretical linguistics. He said, if all these other problems in society were not there, I would do theoretical linguistics. But we have all these problems in society, and I feel duty bound to say something about that. And that, to me, reminded me of some of the great intellectuals. And I don't want to compare people, by the way, because that's unfair. But Sir Thomas More, in the 16th century, the author of a book called Utopia, a critique of the socially unjust society in England during the embryonic stage of capitalism, was such a person. He was executed by Henry VIII, by the way, for refusing to endorse the absolute regime, the absolute monarchy of Henry VIII. He was executed. He also reminds me of people like another Englishman in the 19th century, a contemporary of both Marx and Engels as well as Charles Dickens. His name is Henry Mayhew, who wrote a book called, a journalist wrote a book called The London Labor and the London Poor, who exposed all the injustices of the industrial revolution, of industrial capitalism, and how that impacted the lives of children, women, the poor in London. Another one even closer to him, because she was also an Eastern European of an Eastern European Jewish background, late 19th century, Emma Goldman, an anarchist just like Chomsky, one of the earliest feminists, humane, humanist based feminist, committed to helping the working class, advance the working class children, okay, committed to a better life for working people, placed her life in danger. She was exiled from the United States, by the way, because she was a pacifist, just like Chomsky, committed to the working class, just like Chomsky, against hierarchies, just like Chomsky. Emma Goldman. And in the 20th century, by the way, in the 1950s, the brilliant Afro-Caribbean psychiatrist Frantz Fanon, who wrote The Wretched of the Earth, a psychiatrist, came from the Caribbean, worked in a psychiatric hospital in Algeria, and wrote against French imperialism and how French imperialism was making sick Algerian society, an Islamic country, literally treating patients who believed had been so indoctrinated by French colonial masters that they believed that if they deviated from colonial authority, they were in the wrong for merely demanding their freedom. By the way, Chomsky has been a major proponent of individual freedom and the rights for the individual to exercise freedom. This is the category I place this man in. Again, I don't like making comparisons, but to me, Noam Chomsky belongs in this category. He didn't have to do this. This is an individual who back in the 1950s, international fame for theoretical linguistics, the cognitive revolutionary theory in linguistics. He could have ridden that to fame and glory and a lot of money, a lot more money. You make a lot more money being a conformist than being a dissident. And yet he managed to maintain the integrity, the moral integrity of a brilliant scholar, expand his horizons, do something for society. As he said, he preferred intellectually, his mind was stimulated by linguistics and philosophy and psychology, but he said, we have social problems, so I feel I need to address those. To me, that is a model academic. Go ahead.
Sir, what is the legacy of Professor Chomsky's life's work as an activist, social justice advocate?
I believe that Noam Chomsky has left an enduring legacy because throughout the world, the people who have been influenced by his work, as Henry Giroux, a critic of militarism and neoliberal capitalism, just like Chomsky, pointed out recently in an article he published on the legacy of Noam Chomsky. He points out that this is the man right now who is more relevant, although he's 96 years old, than some young person who has embraced the status quo for personal gain and opportunism. This is the embodiment of a man, an academic, an intellectual who transcends time and remains for 7 decades truly committed to advancing social justice, to advancing environmental justice, to advancing international peace. These are universal ideals that transcend time. Chomsky transcends time. That is his enduring legacy. Um, this is not to say that there are no critiques of Chomsky. Like I said, I often find myself saying, I don't know if I agree fully with that or that or that. Fine. But the body of work of this brilliant intellectual and the prolific work, by the way, prolific. I mean, this is a person who's written about much of the world. Again, starting from linguistics and, branching out to media, neoliberalism, and the environment, and US foreign policy, and the arms race. Prolific writer, right? Very modest. When he was asked about that, by the way, I remember in one interview on television, he was asked about that, and he said, well, I just, some of this stuff, it's in from my speeches. He didn't want to take credit for what he was, and he should have been proud, of course, but this is a truly remarkable scholar with a moral foundation for all times, influenced by his hero. By the way, a lot of people may not realize it, but Galileo, from the age of the scientific revolution of the 17th century, Chomsky's hero. Okay. Um, this is a very creative individual, an individual with a moral foundation based on anthropocentric values. The word means human centered, promoting social justice for all human beings, regardless of distinctions like race, faith, and all that. Okay. That's his legacy, and that's universal, and that transcends time. He has lived a very rich life, a very rewarding life. In my view, rewarding because of what he has contributed to scholarship, and that scholarship was not for self-promotion. It was to advance social justice, to advance progress in society everywhere, by the way. He could have opted uh, for conformity that would have yielded rewards, but he didn't do that. Go ahead.
Sir, is there any concluding remark on this conversation? Would you like to give some advice to our viewers related to this conversation? Any message, any
Yes,
advice?
I recognize that it's not easy, um, and to be a dissident, and I uh, always refer uh, to those in the past who have argued that survival, the Darwinistic instinct for human survival, comes first. Another leftist, an Italian in the interwar period, Palmiro Togliatti, who was exiled from Italy by Benito Mussolini, argued the same thing. He said, I realize that the primary goal of the ordinary person is survival for themselves, for their families. I don't blame people for that. I don't expect them to do anything more than to try to survive. However, those who are in a position like Noam Chomsky was, and this is what he argued in his book about the responsibility of the intellectuals to speak the truth. Those who are in the position and are able to speak the truth, as he points out, to have a moral foundation for what they communicate, are to follow the example of Noam Chomsky. Um, it is far more rewarding to enrich society than to enrich the self. Human beings are not isolated from society, they're part of society. They're enriched as society is enriched. Noam Chomsky has done his part to try to bring out the injustices, whether it's in the domain of foreign affairs and militarism or in the domain of the environmental um, problems that we are having, uh, in the domain of racism and supremacist ideas and far right wing governments that repress and marginalize minority populations. He has done that. He has had a very rich life. And to me, younger people who are able, like I said, I understand the Darwinian instinct for survival of the self and, of course, family and so forth. However, those who are able to follow the path of Noam Chomsky would be rewarded for it as society, um, as they would be making contribution to society, as society is better for it. And that's my final thought.
Thank you very much, sir, for your precious time. I'm extremely thankful to you, and I'm very, very thankful to the viewers. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Bye bye.